Welcome back to History Otherwise, where we explore the paths not taken in history. Today, we're looking at a single moment that, well, it quite literally broke the world.
hmm
Or rather, a moment where the world didn't break and how that changes absolutely everything we know.
It is remarkable, isn't it? We tend to see history as this inevitable road leading right to where we are now. But when you look closely, especially at the Tudor period, you realize it's often hanging by a thread. Or in this case, by the immune system of a 15-year-old boy.
We are talking, of course, about Prince Arthur Tudor, the older brother of the man who would become the infamous Henry VIII.
Exactly. The divergence point for our deep dive today is April 2nd, 1502. We're at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches.
Oh.
In our timeline, as we know, Prince Arthur dies. The sources usually point to the sweating sickness, maybe a nasty flu. But for our purposes, we're pulling on a different thread. We're imagining that the malign vapor, as the chroniclers put it, didn't claim him.
So instead of that black-bordered death notice, a letter of relief goes to his father, Henry VII. Arthur lives.
He lives. And because he lives, the entire scaffolding of modern British history comes apart. To really get our heads around the scale of this, I think we should break this deep dive into three parts. First, the personal domino effect. What happens to Arthur as king? And more interestingly, what happens to Henry? Second, the great matter that never was so, a surviving Catholic England. And finally, we can zoom out to the world stage, the geopolitical consequences, the empire, the new world.
I like that, from the personal to the planetary. So let's start with Arthur himself. There's this image we have of him, when he's remembered at all as this sickly, weak kid. But looking at the sources, that's really not the case, is it?
It's a massive misconception. A lot of it was created in hindsight, really, to sort of justify Henry's rise. The research shows Arthur was being rigorously prepared for kingship. He was generally healthy right up until that final illness. He wasn't some fragile invalid. He was meant to be the great hope, the rose of England. So in this timeline, he recovers. And in 1509, he becomes King Arthur I.
King Arthur, the name alone, it sounds like a legend, not a piece of history.
And that was the whole point. His father chose it specifically to evoke Camelot, to legitimize the new Tudor dynasty. But the reality of King Arthur's reign would have been very different. Based on his education, he was shaping up to be what we might call a chairman of the board monarch.
So less of the jousting and feasting we see with Henry, more paperwork and diplomacy.
Exactly. You have to remember, the court of Henry VIII, all that spectacle and ego, that was Henry's personality. Arthur was solemn, dignified, scholarly. He was a correspondent of Erasmus, the great humanist. His court would have been a hub of Renaissance learning, focused on stability, fiscal caution. He'd have been his father's son.
Right, the steady hand. Which brings us to the person who gets, well, erased in this story. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. If Arthur is king, Henry is just the Duke of York.
Yeah.
The spare.
He is, and this is where the irony becomes almost unbelievable. We have to ask, what did second sons of royalty do back then? They didn't go into trade. They usually went into the church.
Wait, hold on. Are you telling me that Henry VIII, the man who broke the Catholic Church in England, would have become a priest?
Not just a priest. With his connections, he'd have been fast-tracked. The sources suggest he was actually quite pious in his youth, and he had a very sharp theological mind. In our timeline, he used that intellect to justify his divorce. In this one, he uses it to climb the ecclesiastical ladder. We're probably looking at Cardinal Henry of York.
Cardinal Henry, that is just wild to visualize. But it makes sense. He was obsessed with theology, wasn't he?
He was. Even as king, he fancied himself a great theologian. Remember, he actually wrote a book attacking Martin Luther, the defense of the seven sacraments. It earned him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope. In this alternate world, he writes that same book, not as a king looking for praise, but as a loyal prince of the church fighting the Protestant tide.
So he goes from being the Reformation's greatest English enabler to its greatest champion.
Precisely. And if we follow that thread, Henry was never happy being second best. If you've got a wealthy, charismatic royal cardinal sitting in Rome, is it too much of a stretch to imagine him eyeing the biggest chair of all?
You mean Pope Henry IX?
It's a tantalizing thought. The man who destroyed the papacy's power in England could have ended up wielding it. Imagine that. A Tudor pope leading the Counter-Reformation.
That is staggering. A British pope. But okay, let's bring it back to England. Because if Arthur is king and he's married to Catherine of Aragon, the marriage was the whole problem in our timeline.
It was the problem because of the lack of a male heir. That was the king's great matter. It was the engine of the entire crisis. But here, Arthur and Catherine are a good match. They're both serious, intelligent, pious. It's likely that by, say, 1510, they have a son, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall.
And just like that, the dominoes stop falling.
They do. If there's a son, there's no succession crisis. No crisis, no need for an annulment, no annulment, no break with Rome. It really is that simple. The whole English Reformation was driven by a dynastic panic that, in this world, just doesn't exist.
So what happens to all the key players? What about Anne Boleyn?
Anne Boleyn remains a clever, witty lady-in-waiting. She probably marries well, a minor nobleman perhaps, but she never becomes queen. She never loses her head. Thomas Cromwell remains a lawyer. Thomas Cranmer stays a Cambridge academic. The entire machine that drove the Reformation just never gets switched on.
So England stays Catholic, but what does that actually look like? I mean, on the ground?
It looks completely different, physically different. You know the ruins of Fountains Abbey or Glastonbury?
Of course.
In this world, they're not ruins. The dissolution of the monasteries never happens. These places remain huge centers of wealth, learning, charity. They own vast amounts of land.
Which has a massive social impact too, doesn't it? Because the dissolution was the biggest land transfer since the Norman conquest.
Exactly. All that seized church land was bought up by the gentry, the country squires. It made them a powerful new class. In Arthur's world, that doesn't happen. The church keeps its land. Society stays more rigid, more medieval in its structure. The rise of the gentry is stunted. But, interestingly, reform might still happen.
How so? If they're Catholic, do they just ignore all the problems?
Not at all. The church needed reform. Everyone knew that. But here, it would come from within. Figures like Thomas More, who Henry executed in our timeline, would probably lead a movement for reform, supported by the pious King Arthur and Queen Catherine. You get a purified Catholicism, not a Protestant revolution.
And this effect, it must have rippled out across the British Isles. Scotland, Ireland.
This is where you get the idea of a Catholic Britannia. Look at Scotland. The Protestant Reformation there, under John Knox, partly succeeded because of English support. But if England is a devout Catholic power, John Knox has nowhere to turn. He's crushed. The old alliance between Scotland and France becomes a solid Catholic bloc.
And Ireland. I mean, so much of that history is defined by religious conflict with England.
That's perhaps the most profound change of all. The conflict remains political, the crown versus the clans, but the bitter sectarian element is gone. The old English families in Ireland are Catholic. The crown is Catholic. There are no penal laws, no Cromwellian conquest. Ireland integrates into the Tudor realm far more peacefully.
It sounds almost stable.
Yeah.
Compared to what really happened.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm guessing there's a catch. It can't all be peaceful monks and integrated kingdoms.
There is always a catch, and the catch is Europe. Which brings us to our third area, the geopolitical consequences.
Right. Catherine of Aragon. She's not just anyone. She's the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe.
Exactly. It's what historians call the Habsburg knot. Henry VIII played France and Spain off against each other. He was a wild card. But Arthur, happily married to Catherine, is locked into that Spanish alliance. England becomes a junior partner in a dynastic superstate.
So no plucky little England standing up to the Spanish Armada.
Far from it. We're basically a satellite of the Habsburg Empire. English soldiers are fighting and dying in Flanders and France, but for Spanish interests, not English glory. And this changes England's entire relationship with the sea.
Oh, that's a huge one. The Royal Navy, the Sea Dogs, ruling the waves. That's the core of the Empire story.
And that story is never written. Think about Sir Francis Drake or Walter Raleigh. They were state-sponsored pirates, attacking Spanish treasure ships. In Arthur's world, Spain is our ally. You can't just go robbing your allies. Drake would be a common criminal, probably hanged for piracy. The Royal Navy remains a transport service for getting troops to Europe, not a global power.
Which means the New World. America.
Yeah,
It has to look completely different.
it does. This is the bit that really scrambles the brain. There are no pilgrims. The pilgrims were fleeing religious persecution from a church they saw as corrupt. In Arthur's Catholic England, there's no persecution of that kind. So no Mayflower, no city on a hill.
So who settles America then? Does England just ignore it?
Not necessarily, but the motive is different. You get something more like New Albion, settled by the second sons of the Catholic gentry, men looking for land, not religious liberty. You can imagine an America of large estates, tenant farmers, Jesuit missions. It's a feudal extension of Europe.
More like New France or New Spain than the 13 colonies we know.
Exactly. It's a conservative, hierarchical society. It's not the incubator for radical democracy that New England became.
So the American Revolution. It just doesn't happen.
It's very hard to see how it could. The ideological roots of that revolution were so deeply tied to Protestant ideas of dissent and individual liberty.
Hmm.
Without that, you just have a loyal and, frankly, much less dynamic colony.
This connects to something else you mentioned, the constitutional changes back home. You said the king is poorer in this timeline. Why is that? That seems odd.
It comes back to the monasteries. Henry VIII seized a quarter of the kingdom's wealth. It was a massive cash injection for the crown. It made him financially independent for a while. King Arthur never does that. The church keeps its money.
So he's constantly broke.
Relatively speaking, yes. And wars are expensive. To fight these European wars for his Spanish in-laws, he has to keep going to Parliament, cap in hand, asking for taxes.
Which gives Parliament leverage, the power of the purse.
Huge leverage. The great irony is that while the country is more religiously conservative, Parliament might actually gain political power earlier because the king is so dependent on it.
But you mentioned a civil war is probably still on the cards.
Likely under the Stuarts, yes. But look at the difference. Our civil war was fundamentally religious Puritans versus the king. In this timeline, it's constitutional, it's about taxes, it's royalists versus parliamentarians over who has the right to rule. It's much more like a continental power struggle. And without the religious fire of the Puritans, the outcome could be very different. Maybe you get an absolute monarchy, like France.
So when we pull it all together, we've erased Henry VIII, kept England Catholic, averted the American Revolution, and turned the British Empire from a sea power into a European land power.
It leads you to a profound thought about contingency, doesn't it? We like to think that the British identity, Protestant, parliamentary, oceanic, was somehow inevitable in our DNA.
But you're saying it was all just an accident.
A biological accident. It was all the result of a malign vapor at Ludlow in 1502. If Arthur lives, the English identity is European, Catholic, and continental. It's a world of stability, yes, but maybe less innovation. A world of order, but perhaps with less liberty.
It's just incredible to think that the colossal figure of Henry VIII, that Holbein portrait we all know,
Right.
that figure only exists because of the empty space left by his brother.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
Henry VIII, the Reformation, the Empire, they're all just the shadow cast by Arthur's death. The modern world as we know it is a scar that formed over that single wound.
That is a lot to take in. It really makes you look at the history books in a different way. The whole story is so fragile.
History isn't a straight line, it's a tree with 1,000 branches. We just happen to be living on one of them.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey through a world that almost was. Thank you for walking us through the timeline of King Arthur I.
My pleasure. It's always fascinating to explore the otherwise.
And thank you for listening. Next time, we'll be looking at another pivotal moment where history could have turned on a dime. Until then, keep wondering, what if?